All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Dhruv Deepak, and I'm the host for this session. And that means I'll be manning the Q&A panel and uh, troubleshooting if anyone is having issues, um, and as well as keeping time. So today's this session is on tools for next systems, building local autonomy. And your panelists are Sam Butler, Jenna Jablonski, and Scott Christensen. So, Sam, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for joining. And we would like to make this pretty participatory and give people, a chance to come off mute and speak quite a bit, which is, it will take a little bit of massaging, I think, here with the webinar process. Okay, I see videos coming in. So maybe we could do a round of introductions, just to start. So I'm Sam Butler, he, him pronouns. I'm based in the Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, part of Ready Cooperative with Jenna Jablonski and Scott Christensen, who are here. We recently participated in the Beloved Community Incubator program. And we're going to be sharing a facilitation that we are hoping to do in person, kind of in more local community spaces, as well as something that could be instructive for the November teach-ins to hopefully give us more opportunities to kind of put some of this learning into doing as well. And so with that in mind, um, Scott, if you would like to come on and introduce yourself. And I think Jenna will not be able to because Jenna is running the presentation. But Scott, if you want to intro.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. I'm Scott, he, him. I work at the University of Maryland with a lot of startups and environmental startups, and excited to support Sam and Jenna in this work, right? Energy resilience and resilience more broadly. So happy to be here.
Okay, John Stubbs, can you come off mute if you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I missed the what we're supposed to say, but I'm in Brooklyn, New York. I work in elder care recreation. So in some ways it's cultural work, but of course in the capitalist space, over 2/3 of nursing homes are for profit. So maybe that's it. I'm taking a day off to learn, y'all. Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. And we'll get into some related things. I see PG and Marie says that Marie cannot speak. No worries, Marie. Thank you for being here. PG, would you like to come off mute and introduce yourself? Okay. Well, PG, if you, oh, PG's not able to use mic or camera. Okay, Sam Young, would you like to come off mute and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. I'm based in Wheat Ridge. I'm just interested in doing community organizing and just kind of so yeah, I'm just interested in the material.
Great, welcome. And Tina, would you like to come off mute and introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I've just worked in the solar construction industry over 20 years.
Okay, perfect. That sounds fantastic. It's great to have people with more hands-on experience. And so with that, we'll sort of get into this facilitation. We'll get into this presentation. So PG also added, so Marie said in the chat that Marie works with Code Pink, the local peace economy coordinator. It's very much related to what we'll be talking about today in terms of the peace economy and economies that are really made to serve our interests and our material needs and practical ways to approach that. And PG added that they are with the Virginia Solidarity Economy Network, working on a small area plan in their historic community affected by urban renewal and thus interested by the tools. Okay, great. And again, just one more thing for context is this presentation is actually designed as kind of like a facilitation that you all will have the slideshow and you will be able to take to your own groups or communities. And we're glad to sort of assist and kind of helping prepare folks for that or massage it. But hopefully what we discuss will be useful in really moving these types of things forward on the ground. So with that, we're just going to get started, and we'll ask people to come off mute again. And let's see here. Can you go to the first slide? Did you do it? Yeah. It's there. It doesn't look like it's updating on my side, the presentation.
We're still on the title.
Yeah, it's still showing it's on the title. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Just maybe don't do it play from the start. Maybe just exit out of that and you can just keep it and we can see your mouse and everything. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Jenna. All right. So this is the beginning. What we'd like to ask everybody participating is, what do you and your community spend the most money on? If anybody wants to come off mute and share some examples, things that really, when they're adding up and budgeting. Scott says housing. Sam Young, John, Tina, Stacy, housing and food. Great.
Yeah, I'd have to say housing too.
Okay. Feel free to keep adding. And so here people mention housing and food, anything in terms of household essentials for some bigger groups. Can talk about healthcare, childcare. Tina says in California, housing and the utility, right? Energy. Some people in terms of different types of food costs. Some people are doing grocery shopping. Some people are ordering a lot of delivery because of work and other situations. Also even transportation needs, right? When, places are not necessarily walkable or we don't have the types of transit providers, and relying on, ride sharing in more cases that can be pretty expensive. So thinking about all of that, now what we'd want to ask is, what do people feel are actually the most extractive services or businesses that you rely on in day-to-day life? We know housing and food are expensive. We know the utilities are expensive. But does anybody want to share opinions or experiences around things that we need to meet our daily needs that in particular feel extractive? Okay, Amazon. Marie says Amazon. That's great. Feel free to come off mute or share in the chat. Financial services. Stacy, would you like to come off mute and just share how you feel financial services are extractive? Or write more in the chat if that's more comfortable for you. Okay. Don't have a mic, but in transit. Okay, that's fine, Stacy. But if you want to share more about the specific types of financial services, whether that's, big banks, or, other services, we'd love to learn more on that. Okay. Drew says everything in the digital economy, data is the commodity most easily extracted from us. Great. We'll get into this. Marie says food is extractive too if you were getting it from chain stores and your spinach is being shipped in from China. Okay. So if anybody else, great, credit card processing fees. If anybody has a feeling for, a particularly extractive service or business that we interact with in day-to-day life. Sam, are you coming off mute?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I definitely struggle a lot with healthcare. I'm not insured right now because like during COVID, I was able to get on Medicaid, but now I make like slightly too much to to be on Medicaid, but I don't make nearly enough for me to feel like I can comfortably pay for health insurance. So it's just like it feels like something that you do need in order to meet, kind of like the basic health requirements, but I'm in a position where I really I'm really struggling to do that.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and it'll probably become more and more difficult for all of us with things that are happening at the federal level, and we will get into that. So there's some great comments coming into the chat. So PG says, fire sector takes a bit from everything. In aggregate, it is big and its social contribution is questionable. thus finance being the extractive part of just about everything. PG, I'm not sure if I know the acronym FIRE, so if you want to write that out in the chat, and other people, some people might know, I might just be the only one. And John Stubbs said, employment is an extractive service or business. John, do you want to come off mute and say more about that?
Sure, I mentioned I work in an elder care, right? Caring for our elders. But every one of those 200 beds, we meaning the owners who know not a single one of the employees, not a single one of the residents or their visitors, family members, they make money on every back that's in those beds. And the community, well, the local community doesn't necessarily see that money depending on where those owners want to put their money. That's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, and that I have to deal with the enraging state of nursing homes because of my mom has multiple sclerosis, and so she, she's pretty young, like in her 60s, but she needs to be in a nursing home. So, she's one of the more aware people there. And it's just sort of like over time, over like the past, 2 years, she's only been there for like 2 years, but we've seen it severely degrade. Just as far as like there's more money going into administration. There are far fewer people, actually like helping people out. And this is something like I was discussing with her in January, is that it's like, okay, they're making all these, cuts to staffing. That's going to cause more accidents. And it has. And she's been injured because people, don't have time to really, focus on providing good care. So
The capitalists cannot help themselves, Sam. I hear you. It has to go this way. It's like that is the logic of capitalism, which sucks.
Yeah, well, and there's a quote that I was reading yesterday from an author who'll be mentioned in a couple slides named Samir Amin, who he mentioned this about 10 years ago, that as capitalism continues to decline, it will get more and more vicious, which I think we can see in a lot of ways, and, even some of the ways that, yeah, are not as visible that you all are talking about here. So thank you. We could talk a lot more about this. And PG clarified the fire sector, speaking about finance, insurance, and real estate, 21% of GDP in 2023. So thank you all for sharing what feels extractive in the economy for you all right now. I mean, from Amazon to food, strip mining for rare earth minerals for our cars and phones. Marie from Code Pink just said, and of course the examples in the care sector in some different ways. So now the next question here, and this is sort of the purpose of what we're really getting towards, is, are there any services or institutions that you wish could be in community control that could really be organized according to the logic of how we meet our needs locally? And, we have some examples of some problematic areas that certainly come to mind. But if anybody wants to write in the chat, or again, come off mute, Sam, John, or anybody else who maybe hasn't spoken yet, Ensign Cowell, or, Tina or Stacy, if anything comes to mind for, things that we could imagine that, groups of people have run in the past together for our collective interests before, and that we could do it again. Stacy says banking. Right. And so and commercial real estate. So I think that I'm not an expert on this, but certainly when it comes to mutual savings associations, credit unions, of course, there's interesting things there. Marie from Code Pink says distribution of goods, aka Amazon, could be made a public service and serving the public good. I think this is a great way to think about it. PG talks about yard and community green space maintenance. So community control over yard and community green space maintenance, and maybe the ability to do more things together than we could individually at separate and isolated properties. And I've certainly heard about cool things to that end, like community tree orchards, even in residential properties and stuff like that. Okay. I mean, feel free to keep thinking for another minute or so, or write in the chat, or again, come off mute. If, Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, and I've been reading about like the Spanish anarchists during the Civil War, and like one of the things that they were able to do is they were able to do a lot of community like community healthcare work, and like there was also more recently Seco Se Sola in Venezuela. They have these work, they're like a massive worker cooperative, and they're able to run hospitals and so on collectively. And I know that the like Black Panthers and kind of similar groups also had community run healthcare. So those are things that I'm interested in.
Yeah, great. We'll be getting into that. In the chat, Stacy mentions digital and energy infrastructure. I think that's really interesting on both accounts because they're very related. We're seeing, our digital infrastructure, which, according to the logic of, hyper-capitalists and industries, is moving towards large data centers, which of course impacts our energy infrastructure. That impacts, outages in places where we live, water shortages. And uh, Marie says in the chat, running mutual aid and care through time banking rather than through capitalism in terms of services and institutions that could be in community control. Um, John, Drew, can you see John's comment? If that's possible.
Yeah, I'll look at it.
Okay.
So John, in Zoom webinar, the attendees cannot address their comments to everyone. That's a limitation, unfortunately. If you have questions or comments, there is a Q&A panel, a Q&A tab that where you can put your comments. But yeah, unfortunately, in Zoom webinar, only the hosts and panelists can see the chat.
So Drew, if people wanted their comments to be visible by anybody, could we just ask them to maybe just put them in the Q&A, even if they're not necessarily questions that need to be answered, but just so others can see them?
Yeah, I believe everyone can see the Q&A
Okay.
comments.
Okay. Well, we'll try to keep things simple for now, John, and we'll just try to make it clear that everybody can hopefully see. Only the hosts and panelists can see the question and answers. So John and PG, you have both.
I just changed the settings on the Q&A, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So John and PG, can people see the comments that they put in there, or can John or PG try putting in another comment? Testing, can people see Marie's in the Q&A testing? Okay, John says we can see comments here. Yes. All right. This is fun. This is fun. We're making it work. Some mutual aid and self-determination in practice here. Because we don't have control of the digital infrastructure, right? We're working with the limitations of Zoom and what they've done. Okay, and there's replies as we're seeing to John, so you can reply directly in the Q&A section. All right, excellent. So we will be moving on. Just to recap that, we could be using Jitsi, PG says. Yeah, there's lots of good alternatives, which we will get into in this presentation. And to recap that, so we were just talked about things that we wish could be in community control, right? And that we could autonomously run and manage for ourselves, whether it's energy infrastructure, the types of digital tooling that we're using, community run healthcare, as Sam was mentioning. And so in that spirit, before I mentioned the Egyptian author Samir Amin and his concept of delinking, which we feel is kind of really important to think about. And so this concept of delinking basically articulates the way the economy and development works today, which is to say that there are centers of capitalism. So if you think the richest and the most industrialized countries, or not to say the most industrialized, but the richest countries which benefit the most from capitalism, And then you have peripheral countries, which mainly are subject to extraction of their labor and resources. And so Samir Amin writes about in these peripheral places, some people call them the global south. But again, these peripheries can be all around the globe, and peripheries can even be inside countries in the global north. There's organizations like PACA, which the Pan-African Community Alliance, which use the language of internal colonies, speaking about Black communities in the United States. We can kind of think about peripheries in a similar way. This is a little bit of a different reading of Amin's work. It's not exact, but just to tease the model out. So again, as it says here on this slide, in peripheral economies and places, development and industry are centered not on the internal popular demand or the social conditions or self-determination in those places, but on the needs of the core centers of capitalism, like the US, like the UK, like Germany. And in this picture we can see here, you can sort of see how that works, where the periphery, it's sending, unfair exchange of labor, resources, moving towards the center, which accumulates that into capital, and then, sends back credits, rules, ideologies, investments into the periphery, but again, not to support the self-determination of peripheral economies, right? Just to continue accumulating labor and resources to the benefit of the center. So then we can take this we can take this delinking concept, and I think we can think about it in terms of the services and institutions in our lives. So, how can we change our systems so that we can meet our own needs without extraction in our own communities? If it's the healthcare facility, right, that's losing workers and they're finding ways to, slim down staff to increase profits, meeting our needs without that type of extraction, and while supporting peripheries in developing according to their own internal popular demand. So Marie mentioned the strip mining of rare earth metals, right? How can we meet our needs for digital infrastructure or computing, let's say, that does not rely on continued exploitation of places like the Congo, or making just energy transitions without relying on exploitation of lithium deposits, whether in Chile or in Serbia, or in the deep seas, right, as deep sea mining is ramped up. And so that's something to put forward that we could think about for the next system teach-ins, that I think it would be interesting to see more in all of our spaces and as we're thinking locally, right? Not only how we can meet our needs without exploitation where we are, but how we can do that in solidarity with the places that are exploited today for accumulation of resources and for unfair exchange, and to basically de-link the logic of how we meet our needs here and how our comrades meet their needs in other places from the logic of the centers of capitalism, to de-link that and then start developing according to our own internal popular demand, our own internal conditions, and our own logic. So with that, so we're going to just kind of walk through some tools and some examples, and we'll get into some more practical stuff relevant to... Oh, okay. And Dhruv thinks that everybody can see the comments now in the chat, which is great. So we're going to get into thinking about some of the things that folks have already brought up when it comes to tools for next systems. And again, thinking about things for the November teach-ins with participating organizations and groups around the world that could, support this type of development in more places. And PG says to reach across people in the core, we'll have to do something about global financial structures. All right, thank you, PG. So here are some of the different tools and building blocks for, meeting our own needs, developing with autonomy in our own places under community control, and also thinking about ways that lower extraction or exploitation of the peripheries that are almost the status quo, so to speak, today. So we see collective purchasing here, we see community energy hubs, we see land trusts without land costs. That's a little bit more of a local example. We see healthcare. We see a great example of co-op cycle in terms of digital infrastructure. We see open source and self-hosting and how we can actually make that easier and more accessible. And we also see a political example because in the spirit of dual power, where it's advantageous and feasible to be able to get control of political systems, again, where that's possible, to support the types of initiatives that will benefit the worlds that we're trying to make, and thinking about, how we can do that in an X systems kind of way. So starting with collective purchasing, and what we'd love to do if people are open to it, actually to have people participating here to read some of these slides if you could see them. So we'll just try it out, but maybe some people could raise their hands, but maybe I'll just call in some people. John, would you like to read this first slide?
Sure. Collective purchasing, a group of people ordering food and goods together. With larger order volumes, we can order directly from suppliers, just like stores do, and get the best prices delivered to where we are. After gathering orders as a collective and placing them with the supplier, goods can be delivered to houses of worship, community spaces, apartment buildings, driveways, where people can come for pickup or orders can be distributed by neighbors. 3 bullet points: reduces prices 30 to 70% compared to retail, increases access to fresh food and goods in places that lack shops, and reduces car dependency and associated problems of urban sprawl, where 30% of global emissions, entire pollution is a number 2 cause of deforestation. Electric car batteries cause deep sea mining, if I'm understanding all that.
Yeah, exactly. You interpreted it great, John. So just to say, we wanted to talk about some of the other externalities of the status quo, and this also gets to, what Marie and I believe Stacy were speaking about in the chat. With the way that we meet our systems today, even if it's a little bit more invisible, car dependency itself, it's creating this emissions problem that other places in the world don't necessarily create. And it's also creating knock-on effects where if we want to reduce those emissions, now people are talking about electric cars, but that introduces more exploitation. So thinking about collective purchasing and how it's been done around the world as not only a way to help us reduce prices and get more access to what we need, but also to eliminate some of these other externalities, which really come as a consequence of development happening according to the logic of the centers of capitalism, right? Because, urban sprawl and big box grocery stores and suburban developments, moving all kind of taking the capacity to meet our needs more locally, that's not according to the logic of kind of people on the ground, right? That's according to a very different logic that all of that came about. And everybody can see, and just make sure PG and others at this point, you have to click before you write your message, but you should be able to click and send your chat to everyone, just so everybody can see it, and just go to hosts and panelists. And Marie Goodwin from Code Pink says collective purchasing with local food keeps the money in the community as well. Right, great example. So with that in mind, just wanted to go, are there any other benefits of collective purchasing that you can imagine? Are there any other forms of collective purchasing? Some people talk a little bit about healthcare. We'll be getting there. Or any questions that are coming to mind for people. Feel free to post in the chat or just to come off mute.
Yeah.
Maria.
Sorry. This
Oh,
is
go ahead, Tim.
yeah, just as far as like I've done some like kind of like I guess like stuff with food in my local community. Like when I was working with Food Not Bombs, what we would do is we would go to like the Whole Foods and they would have all these foods that like that didn't go into the system for whatever reason. Like it was kind of an incredible amount of food that they would, that would have just gotten thrown out. And like I know there were some like food recovery things that I volunteered for, and I want to rep for Joy's Kitchen and Mutual Aid Mondays in Denver. I'm not sure if they do collective purchasing, but it's kind of a similar, kind of brought it up because they Joy's Kitchen, I believe, does they do deliveries to older folks and people who aren't able to access grocery stores easily, and I guess that's one big advantage I think that you would have with, kind of the collective purchasing system that you're, talking about here is that, there are people who don't really have good access to being able to go to grocery stores. And I think, yeah, it could, contribute to walkability. It could contribute to just like people having more access.
Yeah, those are great points. And to mirror one thing you said, here in the DC area, there's a wonderful initiative called Redelicious, where every Sunday they collect foods similar to the Whole Foods example you mentioned. They work with local farms and they collect the unsold food on farmers market days. Because the farms are not necessarily expecting something out of that if they bring it to their tables. Sometimes they're just getting rid of some of the extra supply that they didn't have sold. So they go around the city, collect all of that unsold produce or different items from these different farmers market vendors. And they bring it to a central location. People can come and pick it up for free. Else have any questions or benefits around collective purchasing, things they want to share? And we'll get a little bit more into it later. Okay. PG says the collective part of the collective purchasing is the rub. Systems of exclusion need to be kept in mind, lest it become yet another way of being more efficient for those who are resource exclusive communities or a tool of gentrification within marginalized communities. PG, it's a really interesting point. I would say feel free to elaborate that on the comments. People could be interested in seeing more. And also, Sam, yeah, in terms of the food access, absolutely. And I get we sort of have to think about, some of the proposals today for improving or expanding food access. And, in some cases, if it involves building new grocery stores, maybe that are better run or in the that can be good, that can also take a couple years, right? And meanwhile, these problems, the extraction, the lack of access, and will continue affecting people that we're in a relationship with. So Stacy says, I think that we can do better than traditional collective purchasing approaches as they rely on centralized distribution. I love decentralized commerce in the local environment, and I think we can use tech to enable this. Stacy, I think that sounds very interesting. And I don't know if you can come off mute or if you want to share more in the chat. Or if anybody else thinks they can interpret what Stacy's talking about when it comes to decentralized commerce in the local environment. Okay, well, maybe we'll wait. Okay, Stacy's going to go to a quieter place. Maybe we can wait for Stacy to do that.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on what PG said. It kind of makes me think about kind of like what Zoran Mamdani is doing or planning to do in New York City, as far as like the kind of like the city run grocery stores. Because I was reading a thing on Civil Eats where they kind of talked about like how other states have done, kind of like it just sort of like, like a lot of places you have really poor food access because you kind of have dollar stores go in there, they push out all the local grocery stores, and kind of the government run grocery stores I think is partially a way to kind of like go into communities that don't have access to fresh food and kind of like figure out like, okay, like how can we, kind of like limit the amount of access in order to be more efficient, not access, but the number of like products that we provide to be more efficient, but also like make sure that we are actually like providing healthy food, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I appreciate you bringing that up. It's something that we're going to hear more and more about, and we're going to sort of see evaluated as one of the approaches, right? One of the policy approaches, one of the approaches in the realm of community control and autonomy, which is to say, is this grassroots and informally citizen-led? Is this municipally funded or supported? There could be a really strong case in the spirit of dual power when we can get the power of the public purse to support this type of thing could be really useful. And Stacy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Sorry, I'm doing some food prep in a commercial kitchen and it's very noisy there. Um, so I made the comment about doing decentralized commerce and using tech to do that. And I think that all of the tools to enable people to buy and sell from their neighbors already exist. But we are captured in this centralized system that makes people go to the grocery store or whatever it is. And so I think we can be disruptive by like enabling around the edges people to change where they get food. And it has the benefits of centralized, centralized purchasing or aggregated purchasing, but it doesn't have to necessarily be aggregated. So think about a commerce experience that's like Amazon, but local and only featuring local merchants, and a distribution network that's like Grubhub or whatever that can help get things out to people who need that, as well as providing like neighborhood pickup points for purchases from any local vendor on the network. Those are the kinds of things that I dream about, and I'm working on in my community.
And which community is that, Stacy? Where?
Santa Barbara, California.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, this is so relevant because one thing we'll talk about later and some people have familiarity with is co-op cycle. Co-op cycle also discusses their work not as sort of being that type of Grubhub technology. It's an open source software for cooperatives or for worker collectives, worker-owned enterprises that originally kind of branded itself as a Grubhub or DoorDash for food deliveries, but also talks about how the software can be used for last mile deliveries, kind of like what you were just mentioning, Stacy. So, and the idea of, being selective about what types of storefronts, what types of restaurants are included in something like that. We could think not just local, but, values aligned, places that have a good reputation for their workers, places with more sustainable practices, think along on class and different issues. And again, just the spirit of having community control over something like that in the community interest, which is great. So there's some interesting things going in the chat. There's quite a few things, but PG mentions a well-intentioned food co-op that was established across the urban renewal boulevard that continually asks for a local grocery store, and the co-op with the CSA is across the street. They're trying to bring or bridge that divide. John Stubbs mentions wondering if a public app option, which we used to hear about with ACA and Obamacare, could change the retail space. Very interesting. And Marie talks about, maybe in the decentralized Grubhub experience that Stacy was talking about, how we could source things locally, get them distributed in less extractive ways in the community interest. Marie wonders if we could use alternative currencies and time banking to pay for the local distribution. And something that comes to mind there is Artisans Co-op, if you all are familiar with the Etsy alternative. They have a very sophisticated point system for participating in that, platform, where they kind of make it clear that anything that you do, which will contribute to this Etsy alternative, right, whether that is creating a storefront, whether that's adding products, whether that's referring people, whether that's making purchases, all of those will give you points, which you can actually use towards purchasing on that platform. So that's what I think about when Marie talks about using alternative currencies and ways that, whether it's people referring others to this type of application that's in the community control, or benefiting the ecosystem as a whole in other types of ways, often just through their labor, a different form of timing. Yeah, if that could actually go towards the product you're trying to buy or towards the costs. So this is great, and we'll come around to this a little bit more later. Really fruitful discussion here. But go another way of sort of meeting our needs locally, right? And thinking about energy. Some folks mentioned the extraction of utilities, the extraction of energy infrastructure. And I think that if we're going to both thinking about local autonomy when it comes to meeting our energy needs, doing it in community control, and also doing it that does not presuppose extraction from peripheral places, whether that is a place like Chile with lithium mines or Serbia, or whether that is the oceans and the deep sea and the more than human peoples and ecosystems that would be facing that extraction for strip mining and rare earth metals. Something that we're exploring on the ground in the DC area and hoping to share with others, and it's informed by work with partners like Living Energy Farm, who's done a lot of community energy in places like Puerto Rico, North Carolina, lots of urban farms and community gardens in the US with a resilience focus, is thinking about community energy hubs, which in this experience, in a really practical way, it is local and easy to assemble solar stations. And so actually, let's see if somebody else is willing to read this slide. Maybe Sam, do you want to come off mute and read this?
Yeah. So community energy hubs, local, easy to assemble solar stations, enabling people to charge devices, work on laptops, listen to music, refrigerate food, cook with ovens, or even charge batteries to bring them home, bringing communities together and lowering energy use compared to individualized high energy home and recreational lifestyles. Reduces energy bills and externalities, emissions and extraction, with community social change, resilience and backup power, off-grid and capable of meeting emergency needs, local third spaces with additional social benefits, foundational just transitions, starting with community sufficiency that reduces other forms of extraction like natural gas and carbon emissions rather than individual consumers and households.
Thank you so much, Sam. And just to clarify, that's to say just transitions starting with community sufficiency rather than a conception of just transitions which starts with individual consumers and households. And the idea being there that, we probably potentially get there to doing more in terms of the individual and on the individual level. But in terms of a place of starting, and we really start with what we need to get to, that begins with community sufficiency and resilience. And we're in a time where, with the expansion of data centers, with increasing heat waves when everybody's running their air conditionings in the summer at the same time or during cold snaps, we are seeing increasing outages. We're seeing the vulnerabilities that creates for ourselves and members of our communities. And we're seeing solutions and proposals come up like cooling centers, like resilience hubs. But again, these can take years to come about and they're worth pushing for. There's also a question of, what can we bring into our own hands in community control and do today? And these pictures at the bottom are actually of systems that, our cooperative effort here in the DC area has put together. You can see a very simple, lightweight, foldable solar panel that is connected to a battery box, which, and different than a standard battery, it has some extra ports so you can plug in some different types of things and making it a little bit easier to do that. It is a lithium iron phosphate battery, which is, it's not ideal, but it's a lot better than lithium ion, and it relies on far fewer rare minerals, far fewer rare earth metals than lithium ion does. So again, when it comes to batteries and when it comes to things in the energy transition, it's useful for us to get more of an understanding of some of the differences of some of these types of batteries and when and where we need batteries, obviously hoping for less extractive solutions to come about. And just adding one more thing, this slide mentions things like refrigerate food, cook with ovens. PG says, how much in dollars are we seeing in that slide? About $500. And we will link to a tool where people can explore that further on a little bit later. But in terms of refrigerators, in terms of ovens, these are actually things that it can also work without a battery, and they can just run directly off of a solar panel. And this is what that organization, Living Energy Farm, if you go to livingenergyfarm.org, they really specialize in. They specialize in renewable energy that is not tied to the grid, because that can have its own challenges and it's not necessarily resilient. Standard grid-tied solar panels on a house that you'll see, when the power goes out, that house loses power too. So it's not meeting resilience in the same way. And other people will typically propose very large battery systems which have their extraction issues with them. Living Energy Farm has done a lot in practice and in the real world where, again, you can take systems like refrigerators, like ovens, like water pumps, and you can connect them directly to a solar panel. So when the sun is hitting it, you're getting the power that you need. If a cloud passes or, it's nighttime, it's not continuing to generate energy, but that's okay because the system is designed to utilize intermittent energy to keep that food cold or keep the food that you're trying to heat up, keep it warming in an insulated oven, or to pump the water, when the sun is there. And using the pumped water or using the energy output as the form of storage, rather than storing electricity in a battery to be able to use it at your convenience whenever you want. So just on that, there's a fair amount of information there, and we'll hope a little bit more accessible. But any questions you want to share in the meantime, or examples that people have heard about when it comes to community energy systems like this, especially on the smaller and more accessible scale? And feel free to share anything in the chat, or just to come off mute. Okay, so I think that keep going, and again, we'll come around to some more information and tools for this later, to PG's comment about how much in dollars are we seeing on a slide like that, to make it easier for groups, whether it's in local groups starting next week or in the teach-ins in November, for people to actually put together those types of stations. So now we want to kind of talk about some, Marie says historically grist mills were community energy. Right, absolutely. And the author Max Eil in the book of People's Green New Deal has a great point about, if we use intermittent renewable energy, not storing electricity, but basically using the sun or the wind to power things when the energy is available there from nature, and then we can store the energy in the end products that we make, whether it's, milled grains, or processed, processed items in a shop, or processed textiles. So anyway, we did want to move here. Some people mentioned the extraction of the housing sector. And we wanted to share some thoughts on a little bit of a different approach to land trusts than people are typically used to, in a way that could make it a little bit more accessible too, which we're calling land trusts without the land costs. This is informed in particular by some policy and community shifts in the Northern Virginia area to open up access to accessory dwelling units on existing single-family properties, as well as a push from congregations, whether it's churches, temples, mosques, different houses of worship, where they want to build housing on the properties that they actually own. So, where we're going with this analysis, and actually ask Stacy, would you like to read this slide? We'll give Stacy a moment, or if anybody else would like to read this slide, feel free to come off mute and I will look for you.
Okay, I've made it.
Great.
I'm outside again. Okay. As we explore cooperative housing in many markets, one of the greatest costs and barriers is the cost of the land. Working with willing property owners, houses of worship, homeowners, etc., we can build new housing units on existing properties, just paying for parts and labor without needing to pay for the cost of land. Congregations building apartments on former parking lots, single-family homes expanding with attached ADUs and renovating basements into new units. Those things reduce costs dramatically of building new units, increasing access to financing and lowering internet rates. Lower mortgages allow greater affordability for tenants, for example, 30% of income equity building, while giving fair, meaningful incentives to participating property owners, support with property tax payments. Creating collaboration among homeowners, renters, community institutions in solidarity. It lowers housing costs in broader market and adjacent municipalities, relieving shortages, increases density and reduces sprawl, and provides community control over housing.
Thank you much, Stacey. And so to make this plain, we'll include a link. It's really this idea of, we're dealing with a housing shortage, also driven by the zoning around us. But can we find ways to build housing on the land that's already there through cooperation, right? Through cooperation in a really grassroots sense, being able to talk with a homeowner or a church that's a property owner and see if this is something they're willing to explore. Again, getting to that point of now we can build a new two-person unit in the case of an accessory dwelling unit next to a single family house, or maybe a multifamily building or an apartment building on a church or a house of worship. And when we talk about that type of really grassroots and local cooperative housing approach, we really are talking about community control over housing. And, what comes with that? What are the rules? What are the procedures? What are the principles? What are different stakeholders getting? How are decisions made? In a really pure sense. And so here are just some pictures. So I can't tell you all of the content about this. I think in some cases it's pretty clear. The first picture, I believe it is a mosque in Europe. You can see that apartment building kind of right in the background there. The second one is, I think that is in New York City. And so there's a history here. There was a lot of grand plans for that United Methodist Church. And I think at one point in the 70s, they had plans for the church itself kind of be like a skyscraper. So I don't know how far they went with the plans, but I'm quite sure that the apartment building on the other side are actually part of the church complex and part of something that they kind of did together. And the picture is a really compelling picture of an ADU. The sizes of accessory dwelling units that people can build existing single family zoned properties, it varies a lot. And that may be second house where you can see the porch. That maybe looks bigger than we typically expect for an ADU. It is a converted garage though. So that maybe seems like a little bit more the size that could be possible for a garage. They actually rent the second unit or the second floor to turn that second floor into an accessory dwelling unit, and then presumably made the garage a nicer place for living there, kind of like downstairs too. So again, finding ways to use what we can to expand housing. So what do people think? Feel free to put in the chat or come off mute. Any critiques of this, any questions or examples you want to share from your learnings and experience, or things you want to learn more about? And it says, Greener Partners, a local nonprofit here near Philadelphia, uses land owned by hospitals, schools for agriculture. The cost of land is also barriers for farmers and food providers. That is a really good point, right? And I think that speaks to not necessarily community control over just housing, but community control of land itself. I see somebody coming off mute, wanted to say something.
Oh yeah. So I worked with it was Colorado. I forget the name of the place. But I worked with an organization for basically a winter that basically what they did was they rented out the parking lot of a church, and they put a bunch of basically a bunch of tents there, and it was kind of like as like a more I mean it was kind of a form of temporary housing for homeless people. Ours was specifically geared towards the indigenous community, and I thought it was really beneficial. I had one person who ended up getting like actual housing in an apartment unit, and then he came back and like because there was a shooting at the apartment, and he was like, I can't, he felt safer at the little encampment that we had than at the actual apartment complex. But I have also seen a lot of criticism of that sort of thing, where it's just sort of like, okay, that's not real housing, it's inhumane, you're still, they're still kind of, basically living, as homeless people, they don't, have, access to a lot of basic amenities still. And I guess I don't know what the finances are on it, but I guess it can be pretty expensive, for how many people it's, only really partially housing. And I guess while I was there, I didn't see a lot of people move into permanent housing. So I guess that was kind of an interesting experience for me, was just kind of seeing, it's not quite, like an ADU or anything like that, but just kind of like, I've kind of seen both. I guess from my perspective, it's like, okay, at least somebody's, doing something to, keep homeless people more safe and have them have, more ability to, kind of have, autonomy. But, I also see where people are saying like, okay, this is kind of a waste of money. It'd be better to spend more money on permanent housing.
Yeah, get some really interesting questions, but thank you, Sam. And PG sharing some really interesting things in the chat, which is essentially lowering housing costs by relieving shortages, not necessarily empirically justified. I think that's a good point, and I would agree. And there's a lot of subtext here, but when we talk about community, and we're talking about a land trust type of model, we're getting participation for people who are going to contribute land or these new units into, let's say, a land trust, that's making decisions on how that housing is distributed and what type of costs. And just to respond to PG directly, I would share the example of the Water Bottle Cooperative in Baltimore, which people be familiar with. It's both a worker-owned cooperative for the rebuilding and the rehabilitating of vacant homes, vacant row homes in Baltimore. But then also the people who live in those row homes are part of the cooperative that owns the portfolio of properties. And they rent. So as you're paying rent, building equity in the portfolio of properties is cooperative, but they set those rent values at 30% of income levels tailored to each tenant. So again, when we talk about community control of housing, it's not just to say, we're going to build these units and then everything's fine. It's really thinking more diligently that, and, leaving it up to us, right? How can we make house affordable for people through whatever tools and ideas are really available to us and we've seen work elsewhere. Interesting. So more thoughts from PG there. So a lot more here. This is a very small section, but we'll try to get through everything during this time that we have. So several people mentioned healthcare as another area that we want more community control and self-determination. Right? And so these are some fairly in-depth slides, but this is a little bit more of a historical example. International Workers Order. I think I'll read through this a little bit more quickly to say that this was following the Great Depression and World War II. The International Workers Order had almost 200,000 members and provided low-cost health and life insurance, medical and dental clinics, and supported foreign language newspapers, cultural and educational activities. It was more than healthcare, but healthcare was a big part of it. It offered insurance to working people at the same rate, regardless of race or occupation. It was the only service provider where African could obtain insurance at the same rate as others, and also the only place where workers in dangerous occupations, coal mining, could obtain at a rate equivalent to other occupations. The International Workers Order grew rapidly from a tiny organization of 3,000 to 5,000 members in 1930 to a membership of 67,000 by 1935. And this relates to collective purchasing well, thinking about what we can do to negotiate and provide healthcare infrastructure when we kind of have large memberships, even in a grassroots way. Here's a really key point, which we need to keep in mind for all of this, and it's a great way to think, is though the International Workers Order was financially solvent and conservatively managed, the New York State Insurance Department said that because it was engaged in, some of this copy and paste from Wikipedia didn't work, but since it was engaged in political activity, which was prohibited to insurance organizations, it was ultimately liquidated, again, by order of the New York State Insurance Department. And the takeaway here is that we know many examples have worked in the past, and they were specifically targeted, repressed, or shut down by opposing forces. And so I think, when it comes to anything we're doing and thinking about community purchasing in even the food and the retail sense, right? Thinking about if that is working, if that's really supporting our interests, potentially at the cost of larger corporations or people who can lobby and have sway over politicians, we could imagine some ways that they seek to repress that and maybe try to enforce commercial zoning restrictions more strictly, or what types of deliveries are available to who. Just to say that it is useful to sort of anticipate and think about ways that what we're talking about in next systems, these types of building blocks, these types of approaches, learn from how they've been opposed in the past and sort of come to anticipate that and think about that and what we're doing. And just to say, one potential example from the International Workers Order is, if they were shut down for engaging in political activity, in addition to providing collective health insurance, well, like it or not, that might be something that we'd have to learn from in order to, make that we can do this in our type of way. So there's some more modern examples here, and I don't have a lot of experience with this personally, but one is Health Rosetta, and they have a lot of really good case studies on their website where they are basically showing how employers, how municipalities can come together to create their own health insurance offering. And it's very grassroots, and it's very in the spirit of self-determination. They are connecting with primary care providers like doctors in their community. They're negotiating rates for their member bases. They're establishing agreements with pharmacies. They're kind of doing it all. And again, go on their website. There's some pretty large and significant case studies from kind of large corporates that have, I guess, an interest in their workers' welfare, to city governments that have implemented this type of this type of system quite well. And to go to one other different type of example, you can see is crowd health. Crowd health describes itself not as insurance, actually, but healthcare, where if you join crowd health as a member, you pay $55 a month. That's for your standard care. And then when you go to your doctor's office, there's no network. You can go and see any doctor. And they basically, that $55 a month rate acts for it's kind of like a reimbursement for that standard care in a way. But then one of the bigger reasons we all have health insurance is when accidents happen or when we have medical emergencies that can potentially drive people into debt or financial ruin just by having that happen, by having the high deductibles. So what Crowd Health really does as a membership is that in addition to your $5 a month base fee, all members pay between $0 and $140 a month, which is basically like pooled emergency assistance. So if there are more people in the network, which I think has hundreds of thousands, if not more members, if there's more people in a given month who have emergencies and have claims that month, then all of the members collectively will maybe pay up to the maximum of $140 to help everybody meet their claims. And, if there is miraculously a month where nobody has an emergency happen, nobody has an accident happen, then you would presumably pay $0 that month because there are no claims to pay out. So in addition to that type of approach, the organization, the member association, it actually negotiates down the costs with hospitals or wherever you got services from. So that's right now, that's active. They have a very interesting and in-depth FAQ page, which whether or not you agree with it, it does do a very good job of outlining some key problems with health insurance today. So interesting for further reading for those who are interested. And on that note, anybody have questions about those or things they want to talk about or examples that they're aware of? And we have some things in the chat here, but feel free to share in the chat or come off mute. And we're seeing So PG says they were contending with governance, presumably talking about the International Workers Order. You know you're getting it right when they come after you. John Stubbs says, regarding the IWO being liquidated due to strict laws supposedly protecting consumers, with the idea of pension investment funds being used to monetize the new economy. Apparently, US law can make it hard to invest those dollars in anything that's not maximized profit. Interesting. So, like it or not, maybe we have to be learning from the past and seeing how we can best, achieve our ends. Marie says during COVID, local herbalists branded together to make a CSM, a community supported medicine group. We all made medicines, antivirals in particular, and gifted it to our neighbors. People left money if they could pay for the tinctures themselves, etc. It was redistributed to the herbalists as they needed to purchase supplies. It ran a profit, even though it was done in gift. That is a brilliant example, Marie. And, that's definitely the type of thing that should be in one of these slides. Again, if anybody has any other examples, feel free to share in the chat or come off mute. Another that I've recently learned from a meeting of the Pan-African Community Alliance here in DC, actually talking about the opioid epidemic in New York City in the 1970s, and the way that grassroots collectives, people with varying medical experiences, were actually treating opioid addiction among members of their own community through things like acupressure, when they couldn't even afford needles for acupuncture, but starting with acupressure, really deep and intentional massages that would help people detoxify and deal with addiction, and getting up to acupuncture. Eventually, there's been a Vice documentary about this. I forget the exact name, but something to do with the People's Medical Clinic in New York City in the 1970s dealing with the opioid epidemic. And then even kind of smaller and simpler, there's a practice called ear seeds, where it's a form of acupuncture where you can just put the needles kind of right in different places in your ear. And when we talk about really grassroots autonomous medical care, and treating something, as severe as opioid addiction without methadone, without some of the more intense infrastructure we're used to thinking about, but basically through experienced community members giving massage, learning a little bit safely how you can use practices like ear seeds to help relieve some of those symptoms. And, according to what we can see from the testimonies, those things really worked. So very useful as we think about folks like Sam mentioning earlier, the costs of healthcare and health insurance today, ways we can make sure we have what we need there, both insurance in terms of accidents, in terms of the more routine types of care we might need, and how we can make it so that we can afford it. And it's really run in our community's benefit and our community's interest. So next, wanted to briefly mention co-op cycle, which some people have mentioned, which again, we will get down to this and we'll kind of go a little bit faster due to time for some of these. Co-op cycle is a open source to cooperatives, self-hostable alternative to a Grubhub or an Uber Eats or a DoorDash, that actually allows delivery workers and bike delivery workers and gig workers to run the application themselves and to own and design the applications themselves. So they can get better wages, better prices for community members, and really get more towards community control over this kind of the logistical aspect of how some of our needs are met when we're, too busy to go to the grocery store. Some people have accessibility issues, things like that. So if you go to the website for Co-op Cycle, if you just search it on a search engine, we'll include it a little bit later. There are dozens of instances of this application in cities across Europe. Interestingly, when a co-op cycle version is starting in a new city, it really often starts just with conversations amongst local delivery workers who could really use this and be stewards of this in their own places, and the people who have the most experience. It gives the community agency over the restaurants and businesses that are listed on the platform that you're available to buy food from, different types of supplies from, as Stacy was talking about, thinking local and thinking about, having a little bit of over what we want to present and what we really want to share with the communities. And ultimately, it's getting to kind of a food and logistical system that's operated by workers, to use community members, that's more by and for our stakeholders in communities. So, and again, we'll sort of link to some information there a little bit later. If anybody has some quick questions about co-op cycle, in terms of the tools and building blocks for thinking about next systems teach-ins in November and things that we can bring to our own communities today. Okay, then we're going to move on in the interest of time now to, people mentioned Co-op Cycle is an open source application licensed so that cooperatives, right? It's open source to cooperatives. That means that on your own computer, on your own server, you can actually run that infrastructure completely separate from the organization Co-op Cycle or the federation of organizations that is Co-op Cycle, which maintains the software. So we're getting to open source and self-hosting and talking about digital infrastructure. Drew mentioned one of the most active things we deal with is companies that extract our data. And it's one of the easiest things that can be taken from us when we have so much going on digitally in the world. So something we wanted to share for next systems, and again for this type of local facilitation, is just to say we can self-host technology. PG earlier mentioned Jitsi and even alternatives to Zoom. These really are things that we can self-host when they're open source. And self-hosting means, right, not just taking the corporate version or the corporate offering, but installing that type of application on a computer that we control so we can make it accessible in our community or our organization. Some of this is scary. It can be intimidating. Some of it can be pretty technical, but we just want there's increasingly make this really, really easy. And one of the easiest examples is WordPress. So, if people here are familiar with WordPress, a lot of the important features you need are actually paywalled, kind of like I think the very basic instance is free. But as soon as you want to get into a little bit more customization, or as soon as you even want to use plugins, the basic promise of WordPress is the ability to use plugins, you're talking about $40 a month, right? So that's their subscription. It is what it is. It's not the worst thing in the world, but there's probably lots of organizations that are using not that well-visited WordPress websites. They're not maintaining it that much, but they have to keep it up there. And meanwhile, they're paying, $500 a year for that. Thank you, PG, for sharing the Lincoln Detox documentary about the People's Medical Clinics with opioid addiction in the 70s. That's in the chat. But anyway, so we could talk about a lot of organizations that are paying $480 a year just for a barely customized WordPress plan. Meanwhile, there's this great service called Picapods. You can look that up in a search engine, or maybe we can put it in the chat. Picapod makes it, with one click, no technical experience, you can run that same WordPress instance for $2.50 a month. Or if you have the costs might go up a little bit more. But the key thing is they're enabling you to take the open source WordPress software without any technical experience, one click, and host it yourself. And then you're paying the bare costs of running that software on your own computer instead of paying a corporation to run that service for you and then paying whatever price that corporation will give, pricing per user, per seats. So now we can talk about some of these cost savings. Paying like we do for a lot of subscription per seat or per user. I think Zoom might be like that. Really paying the costs to run that software, which can be dramatically different. If we start doing this with some of the that are actually accessible, mention some of them like Coolify, we start to get more self-hosted technology we rely on. I don't think it's useful to recommend things that people aren't really capable of doing or that's uncomfortable. So when we say this is possible and it's easy, like you really can make it happen and can start learning in a new type of way. All of this gives us greater choice over the technology we use and the ability to use values aligned technology. Right? If that's a Jitsi over a Zoom or if that's a WordPress, a self-hosted WordPress over a Wix with respect to different efforts. And finally, if we're using more open source software than corporate software, we're also contributing to these open source ecosystems that are kind of like maintaining some of these digital building blocks. So I think it could be useful just take a moment for if anybody has questions on that, or if anybody wants to write in the chat, what applications does your organization or institution or group pay the most for? And what applications do you most want alternatives for privacy or equity reasons? Feel free to come off mute or write in the chat. And I know it's 2:25. If people can stay, we started 5 or 10 minutes late, so if we're able to stay till the end, that's great. We'll kind of move efficiently, get towards some tools to help you of this, which you receive. Marie says, yes, there's some alternative to Slack. Slack is very expensive. Marie, if you could write in the chat, like if you know how much your organization might be paying or general kind of per person. And then typically, the main alternative, Slack alternative, Zulip, right? Any other, softwares that people, Stacy, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love this discussion, and I think that I learned about a few new things that I need to check out. But my experience with all of this has been that the kind of holy grail is interoperability for these things, because we are used to this very interconnected tech system, and it's really hard to operate on alternative tools that kind of function in isolation. So if you know of any platforms that are integrating these tools so that it's possible to have more of an equivalent experience to the consolidated system, I would love to know about that too.
Yeah, one example, the example that comes for me, Google Drive, maybe, where you have the collaborative document, the presentations all together.
I'm talking a little bit more about how the delivery service platform would receive data or send data to the e-commerce platform, which connects to the financial management, bookkeeping kind of platform, and the inventory management. Like those systems. They're generally all interconnected, and there are plenty of companies that just like serve the interconnection of tools for this experience that we're used to. And I think the challenge with these alternative tools is that I haven't found a lot of ways to connect them without developing that.
Great. Okay. That makes sense, Stacy. And so Stacy, you're speaking about kind of co-op cycle a little more specifically there when it comes to last mile distribution, food logistics.
Yeah, any of them. I mean, WordPress, people use that for e-commerce. So, the connection between an e-commerce platform and like the co-op cycle, that's a challenge that I don't know solutions for, but things like that.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to really getting close to, in our organizations, in our spaces, what are the jobs to be done, and making sure we're not just proposing alternatives without having that type of context if we want things to be able to stick. And just, if people do need to go, I'm just going to show to these slides again. There might be some updated Drew emails of the people who joined this presentation, follow up to them. If we kind of add a little bit more information into those slides. If you want also, you can subscribe today around an update. If you subscribe there on our website, if you to go, but we'll try to finish this out here. So in the chat, so people mentioned Slack. Drew talked about Blackboard Anthology and Google Classroom. Drew, do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Not in terms of alternatives, because I'm not too aware of those, but that really came to mind in terms of these digital platforms that are all consuming and ingest a lot of data, which goes into the ether somewhere. I do know that at our university, George Mason University, we've been battling with providers for those kinds of services, especially when it comes to maintaining and publishing curricula and having online discussions within courses and supplementing your coursework. And very often there are homegrown solutions available. I mean, George Mason University is a huge research university with a big computer science program. And there are solutions that can be built and customized here, but we find that the administrators take the path of least resistance very often, and they go for the big, Microsoft or Google kind of solution. So there's conflict there as well.
I mean, yeah, appreciate you sharing that. And I think that speaks to some of the challenges that, PG mentioned is we need more people climbing the learning curve, some of these types of things. And then Dhruv is also talking about it's true, right? That people will take the path of least resistance. And then thinking about, how we can lower the barriers and how we can take the digital infrastructure that we want and ultimately make it so there's less of a hurdle in kind of adopting it. And speaking of Stacy's concerns, right? Like, will this interoperate with other business flows, other kind of key cogs in the system that I use? And then a key point that Dhruv also was talking about is where is that data going? It's great. Think about all of the K through 12 schools. Think about all of the middle schools, all of the high schools for, our young people around the country. I think about this quite a bit. All of them are presumably getting Gmail addresses, right? Even if it's, a school address, it's being administered by Gmail. Gmail or Google is probably taking all of that data from emails, using it for AI training, using it to build profiles for ad selling, things like this. Thinking about, the types of data that's being taken from Blackboard and Google Classroom and all of these students and teacher interactions and contributions and what that's going towards. What it's probably not going towards, right, is like building our capacity and our autonomy and things that will support our freedom in our communities. We know what the logic of that is. It's going to places that will increase profits for Google or for the corporate that's doing it, without really much regard for anything else. And that also gives them the resources to make really good experiences that are the path of least resistance. So these are things that are kind of useful to think about. An interesting PG says your email will not get through to people anymore if it doesn't have the heft of a Google behind it to keep it off of blacklists and out of filters. I don't know if this is completely true. I've used a email called Fastmail for a number of years, and it does seem to have pretty good deliverability. So big problem is talking. There are, still to it. And Dhruv talks about, yes, the logic of extraction from some of these schools, taken out of communities, right? And when being taken and analyzed somewhere, we benefit from type of analysis. So what Dhruv was getting at in terms of data commons earlier. So this is good, and we'll try to kind of a couple of minutes. So one when it comes to developing local autonomy and this idea of dual power, right? It is where it is feasible and advantageous, thinking about getting control over the institutions that can support our work in these areas, whether that's, municipal governments or public schools and, opting for open source or more ethical technologies there by getting control in some of those places. Or winning public support for municipal grocery stores if that's something that we want to pursue, or subsidies for resilience hubs starting small or getting bigger, subsidies for local distribution and logistics solutions like co-op cycles, all these types of things. So one of the key problems when it comes to politics right now, in short, is in many cases, the people who are supposed to represent our communities in these representative governments don't actually represent our interests. they have a whole other set of interests that best case they're sort of compromised on, and worst case they're much more accountable to those other interests which don't really rely on our communities. So here's a slide thinking about a different approach to that, again, in a systems way, which is based on some work that, folks like PG and some others in Virginia attempted this past year. And it's really based on much older examples of how political candidates for elections wouldn't necessarily be appointed by the party, wouldn't necessarily just be running on ambition, but you'd have different sectors in the community which would come together and put forward nominees and come together almost like caucus-like to figure out, people who they feel could really represent an. This is a longer slide. You can explore more in the slide too in depth, but the idea with U.S. elections come up in 2026, the deadline to get oh, I'm back. I don't know if Drew meant to mute me or this room is going to somebody else. Yeah, so with U.S. elections in 2026, there's going to be filing deadlines for primaries starting in December 2025, and then moving towards like March 2020. From December 2025 to March 2026 is when the filing deadlines to get in the primary ballots is for a lot of these, congressional races, local, municipal, state level races. And thinking about, instead of doing for kids to come up and represent, what if we community? Who do you think would represent our community well? Who do you think would be honest? You can actually assemble who are giving ideas, stating folks, hold a vote before a primary even happens, before candidates even file, to say, okay, these are the people to coalesce for these types of elections to run for these offices. And a key there, needing to think this or third party a little bit more dogmatically either way, we can just start from the of what is going to serve our interests, what is the strategy that's going to work for us. And now when we're in a community source candidate like this into an election process, they're not going it alone. They actually have a full group of people in the community behind them who want them to be there and are in a position to support the campaign, not because they're interested in that candidate's political ambitions, because is their candidate and representative, so it's to our own interest. Oh, I'm saying we have to wrap up. See, if we could wrap up. Oh, the schedule's tight today. Thank you. I missed that. All right, guys. In the next slides, we can just kind of go through them a little bit quickly here. Just have tools in the slides here, clubs and some exercise, some online tools and guides. For the community energy hubs and how you can explore that, I'm just dropping a link in the chat right there. So you can explore a tool there together, an interactive way to size those types of energy systems. Co-op cycle, you can go on their site to learn more. We had that we're going to time permitted that could be helpful for some of these grassroots. So finally, the idea of this facilitation is something you can also do locally, which we could help with groups and communities in Europe. And also, we would love to put forward some of these building blocks, some of these lessons, some of these ways about delinking center logic and recentering communities for how we're going to meet our own needs into the next systems teach-ins. So that's all. I think we're going to stop recording now and give it to the presentation. Be in touch.
Great. Thanks everyone for a really engaging panel and group discussion. It was excellent. I'm going to stop recording now.